This video is called Why Violating a Person's Vagina is Worse Than Violating Their Pronouns. It's in reaction to a spate of gender fraud court cases that have happened in the last several years. These are cases where someone deceived another person into believing they are the opposite biological sex they are in order to have sex and relationships with them. And I don't know what is going on in Britain that produces so many individuals that commit this previously exceedingly rare crime, but there have been 6 of these cases in that one country where the accusers claimed biological females impersonated males in order to gain emotional and sexual access to them. And often they did this to teenagers several years younger than they are. Some of these females are lesbian identified, and some are trans male identified. I wasn't sure exactly what the title of this video should be. I had several alternatives, such as why I wouldn't deceive someone into fucking me based on my self-perception, and neither should you. Attack of the uncannily realistic dildos. British mamas ain't raising you right. Liberals against sexual consent. How the left is eating their own babies. And if Zero says it's dick, you must acquit. But I decided why violating a person's vagina is worse than violating their pronouns really gets to the point of what I want to focus on here. So there have been 6 of these cases in Britain recently, all involving females. Of the British cases, a couple of them are extremely bizarre. They're pretty difficult to believe, but at least 4 of these cases seem pretty plausible, where it's pretty much confirmed that there was deception. The Jennifer Stein's case, who is a lesbian, Justine McNally, who was a lesbian teen at the time and admitted to the deception, Kyron Lee, I think it's pronounced Kyran, Kyron Lee, a trans man. Chris Wilson was 25 and pursued 15, 16-year-old girls and lied about his age. Most 25-year-olds that have sex with 16-year-olds tend to be kind of sketchy, even if everything is on the table, in my opinion. This shows that females can act in self-centered and manipulative ways just as males can. And in most of these cases, the accusers were several years younger than the perpetrators, which might not have been enough to be illegal, but could have been intentionally exploitive or indicating maturity level problems with the perpetrators or other mental issues going on with them. So 2 of these cases were very difficult to believe. In these cases, I think it's questionable whether or not the accusers knew what was going on. One was the Gemma Barker case, who had multiple identities. She supposedly tricked a 15-year-old with not 1, but 2 alter egos. At the very same time, she was friends with this person as her actual female self. And the accuser broke up with the first alter ego, at which point the second alter ego was created, and the person dated that second alter ego before they apparently realized what was going on, and that both of these boys were actually her female friend. I don't buy this case. I think maybe the parents got involved. It's just so completely over the top and unbelievable that she didn't know these 3 people were actually the same person. The most bizarre case was the Gail Newland case, and it's so complicated I've got to read the list here so I don't miss any of the details and forget to tell you about them if you haven't heard about this case. This case involved a lesbian-identified woman who apparently went to extremely elaborate lengths to deceive a woman that she was a male. She posed as a man on Facebook. This was an ongoing identity with her. She started when she was 15 years old. She started dating the woman and bound her breasts and lowered her voice. Every single time they got together, the accuser was blindfolded. The reason for this is that Newland told the accuser that he had horrible scars and that he didn't want her to see them. They would get together and watch television and even sunbathe, all with the accuser blindfolded. Even more bizarrely, at the same time, Newland was acting as the accuser's best friend, as her female self, which makes this really unbelievable and similar to the Barker case. the couple had sex 10 times before the victim realized that she was using a prosthetic penis, and it was actually her female friend. Prosthetic penises were also used in several other of these cases. Newland claimed that the accuser knew she was a woman all along, and they were just both role-playing. And it is really difficult to believe this case just because it's so ludicrous, and it went on for such a long time. The only explanation I have is that the accuser was just extremely naive or possibly just not very bright. And there are people out there like that, and they're vulnerable to being exploited, but that doesn't mean that they deserve to be exploited. The sentence in the Newland case was 8 years, and this is a harsher sentence than the judge gave for pedophiles, but those aren't the details that I'm interested in debating here. And I'm currently leaning towards Newland being guilty because of these text messages the accuser sent after discovering this. She said, "How could you do this to me for 2 years? You have been a fake. You have manipulated me. Are you for real? You should be locked up for what you have done. You are really a piece of work. I have just one question. Why me? Why have you no other explanation other than you are pure evil?" She genuinely seemed shocked and horrified, and Newland sent back apology messages to her. So I don't know what happened for sure here, but there is definitely some incriminating evidence. As far as my feelings about sexual assault in general, I do recognize that there are, in fact, gray areas when it comes to sexuality. I don't go throwing around the word rapey a lot. I think it's overused and hyperbolic often. I don't think Blurred Lines was a rape song. I don't really agree with yes means yes laws or affirmative consent laws. I think they have good intentions, but I believe they're overly intrusive. Some people don't just want these rules on college campuses, but they're trying to get them passed in city and state ordinances. And I don't want the government regulating what my spouse says to me, who I've been with for 18 years, before I get rolled around. I'm not a child. Women are not children, and I don't support feminism that treats them as if they are. On the other hand, I feel very strongly that you have the right to go through life with having your safety and boundaries respected. That's not how the real world works, but we all need to try and operate under that assumption and try and live up to it. And that's probably why I was really drawn to training in martial arts, which I've done for years in various grappling and weapons and striking styles under many different teachers at many different schools for a long time. And a lot of my teachers were lesbian feminists, older women who had started their own schools, and several of them developed really good, very well-researched self-defense programs. And they went into schools and also taught adults. And these were really great programs, and you need to try to teach people not to be paranoid, but also how to handle the real world, especially children. And you don't want to scare them, and also you need to teach them it's not mostly stranger danger that's the problem. It's more people that you know that will wind up hurting you either physically or emotionally. It's the bullying, it's abusive parents, it's the creepy uncle. So I spent a lot of hours in schools teaching foster kids, Girl Scouts, high school kids, adult men and women, these programs. So maybe that's why this issue pushes my buttons so much. I think just boundaries and safety and emotional safety have just been something that's just been really important to me. But I acknowledge that there are some gray areas, and do I believe that it's possible that a woman, especially a teenage girl, with their parents hanging over them to falsely accuse a lesbian or trans man of manipulating them into sex? Yeah, I definitely think that is possible. However, my adamant opinion is that gender dysphoria is not an excuse to violate another human being's sexual boundaries. And there just isn't any nuancing this for me. And I want to address arguments that other people are making that it is acceptable, because there are plenty of people out there that are doing that right now. I don't want to go into how this should be handled legally. I'm not saying that these people don't deserve any compassion for having gender confusion. I'm not saying lock them up and throw away the key. But I do think there should be some recourse for these victims, and other people disagree about how the state should handle this, but I mostly want to talk about this as a moral issue here, because some people are even questioning that, and that's mostly what disturbs me. And anything coming out of trans activism gets you accused of being a hateful TERF and a bigot, so I just want to make it clear, I don't think most trans people are predatory. Most believe in disclosing and being open for everybody's emotional and physical safety, involved. And over half of these cases involve lesbians, and I don't want women going around behaving this way either. Here are some quotes by the accusers about the damage they say this has done to them, because it shows this was as bad for them as getting pinned down and raped in an alley, and who are we to discount that? Carol, the victim in the Kyron Lee case, said, "I didn't consent to having sex with a woman. I consented to having sex with a man. And what happened is still very much affecting my life. I was lied to and manipulated into falling in love with someone who deceived me. That has hurt me emotionally and physically. Finding out that Kyron Lee was a female shocked me to the core. I truly believe that Kyron was a man. I don't think he fully understands the pain he has caused me. I don't feel that he feels any remorse. I don't think I will ever be able to forgive him for what he has done." Her lawyer said this: "She was shattered when Kyron escaped jail and now suffers anxiety so severe that she generally won't leave the house alone." So she not only got fucked literally, she also got mind fucked. And she's suffered some damage over this. And when I hear people minimizing this, it really kind of infuriates me. The accuser in the Newland case said she would have rather been raped by a man, just straight up. So these are the kind of statements they've made, and the other victims have made similar statements. So here are the arguments coming from trans activists, some high-level ones around these cases, because they're the people that are most concerned about this. So the first one, a person doesn't have a right to bring any charges in these cases because it misgenders the trans person. Here's a quote from a trans woman activist and lawyer, Alex Sharp. "The state literally refuses the gender identities of transgender people, or at least allows them to be trumped by cisgender complainants' understandings of gender. And it is important to recognize that for some transgendered men, a prosthesis is experienced as a penis. To insist on a distinction between the fleshy and the non-fleshy penis in legal constructions of consent is to misunderstand this important phenomenological issue and point of gender variance." Phenomenological, a clusterfuck word for a clusterfuck rationalization. Using fancy words isn't going to make this argument any more rational or any less callous towards the feelings of the victims. What Alex Sharp is saying here is that a heterosexual woman is obligated to concede that she should subjugate her own sexual orientation and her right to only have something shoved up her own vagina that she consents to in order to confirm the gender identity of a biological female. The idea here is that a trans person's gender identity and sexual orientation are so sacrosanct that it gives them the right to completely violate the gender identity and sexual orientation of another person. So not only is this position immoral, it doesn't even hold up to basic logic. Asserting that your sense of self should take precedence over the sense of self of another person is delusional, and in the case where you do that in a way that traumatizes another person is just a really insensitive way of viewing this whole issue in general. People have every right to base their sexual orientation on biology, not your personal feelings, and you're completely disregarding their rights to their own body autonomy and their own identity. This is an element in trans activism where to misgender someone is actually worse than sexually violating them. It's the final lowest point in the narcissistic downward spiral trans activism has taken in the last several years, unfortunately. And it's starting to turn, some former hardcore allies like myself away from the movement when people come out with pushing ideology like this. Here's another example of this attitude from Penelope Childs from the Plymouth Law and Criminal Justice Review. It's a law student blog. Is it possible to interpret McNally, the case, as being based on the notion that transgender boys are not real boys? If so, this would be to deny trans identity altogether. So for people making this argument, you have to respect the reality of trans people and their identities and respect that that exists. You have to extend that all the way to submitting to sex with them against your own knowledge. And I'm going to make the assumption here that this writer is a liberal because it's mostly liberals that are promoting this mostly. This is all an example of the reality of how the left has devolved to the point now where they are eating their own babies. The left were once the champions of women's sexual agency with their Take Back the Night marches, No Means No programs, affirmative consent laws, and they're now shitting all over that concept because now somehow it's more important to affirm the self-perception of an oppressed minority group. There are other examples of the far left eating their own babies. For example, feminist and LGBT groups attacking feminist thinkers that, for being Islamophobic, for criticizing how women and gays are treated under Islam. And also feminists minimizing the problems with rape and other sexual violence coming from some immigrant communities in Europe for exactly the same reasons. And the left wing's moral confusion is causing them to become traitors to their own treasured causes in favor of other causes, which is kind of interesting, but I'm sort of going off on a tangent. Anyway, you get the point. Alex Sharp goes on to say that people can choose to avoid trans people in their own sexual relationships, but if she is deceived, what she ought not to be entitled to do is mobilize the power of the state against other men with whom she chooses to have sex. To permit her to do so is to rub salt into the wound of a prior ontological assault, the denial of gender identity. Okay, Alex, so she shouldn't be able to mobilize the power of the state in this situation. But trans activists are perfectly fine mobilizing the power of the state to fine somebody $250,000 for the crime of misgendering somebody. This is the actual case in New York City now. Some trans activists don't think someone who's been sexually violated because they were lied to and manipulated should have legal recourse, but to not utter a word someone demands is worth a six-figure sum. So here, it is perfectly fine to mobilize the power of the state, not to protect trans people from violence or housing discrimination or employment discrimination, as the state, certainly should, but to force others to use completely recently made up words like sie, here, I, am, ihr, she, the list goes on and on. The bottom line here, having someone not validate queer theory and words, having somebody not validate words, is significantly more horrible than penetrating a woman's vagina with something that she didn't want to be penetrated by. Is it am I the only person that sees this as supremely messed up? Jordan Peterson, a psychology professor at the University of Toronto, is currently refusing to adhere to a Canadian law that will make it hate speech not to use the preferred pronouns of the now 50 different gender identities that exist out there, because he doesn't support that gender ideology, and he rightly states the government should not be allowed to force someone's speech and thought police their views. And I agree with him, and he may lose his job or worse. So some activists want to force people to adhere to their self-perception and their ideology, right up to who you decide to spread your legs for. This is just completely unlike any other civil rights movement that we've seen in the past. So here's another point that they argue. And it's, well, here's an inconsistency that I would like to point out. It's a God-given right for trans people to reject their own bodies, but it's bigoted and transphobic for other people to do so. So this view is a glaring inconsistency. Trans people claim their true nature causes them to reject their biological sex and thus their own natural body, instead choosing pretty extreme medical interventions. But if somebody else rejects that very same body because of how they see their true nature, this is somehow bigotry. And I think it's just so much healthier for all non-conforming people in general, and that includes me, to embrace our outsider status and all of the difficulties and potential rewards that come with that, instead of trying to insist that we are exactly like everybody else. And now, in the case of the trans issue, people now must accept being punished for using pronouns that don't affirm your identity, but then gives them no recourse in the law when you physically penetrate their sex organs in a way that makes them feel violated and violates their identity. So here's another point that is argued. Lying about your biological sex is the same as lying about other things about yourself, something people do all the time. Here's a quote by trans woman and activist Jane Fay, I believe it's pronounced, speaking in the Independent. "Since when has anyone told the whole truth prior to taking a partner to bed? Men and women lie constantly about age, income, job, and marital status. These, however, are not frauds that perturb the legal system. Nor, it would seem, is the case of an undercover policeman lying about his day job." Lying about being an undercover cop and having sex with somebody, which it's not illegal, but I'd admit that's pretty violating, and it's probably the best example given to bolster this argument. But I'm not going to argue the dozens and dozens of scenarios we could go into here. I'll just quote a gay man's comment I saw on a message board I read to address why gender fraud is different. "You're not fucking someone's diploma." So, I think that sums it up. Another argument. The public must adhere to the trans community's destruction of the meaning of language. So, I want to address the role of the destruction of language in regards to trans identity politics and some of the problems that are being created with this particular civil rights movement's use of language. So here's the best example of taking away people's ability to communicate meaning effectively and the problems that it causes. Again, my favorite person, Alex Sharp, in relation to an accused trans man. "His statement regarding penetration is not rendered untrue or deceptive simply because Jill assumed him to be referring to a penis rather than a prosthetic device, which for some trans men is a semantic difference." So in this world, there is no actual difference between a human penis and a silicone cock simply because somebody says it's so. This, along with other points I've made, puts trans logic so far down the rabbit hole that dropping lots of LSD will only serve to make this seem more ridiculous. A dildo is not a penis is not a dildo, an Oompa Loompa is not Ruth Bader Ginsburg, just because someone wishes it so. So another argument, the pain and suffering of the trans person is a mitigating factor, and lack of sex equals oppression. Here's a quote from The Ethical Imperative of Disclosure by Natalie Reid on Free Thought Blogs. And don't we deserve a chance at love and sex and intimacy? Isn't that a basic human right? Don't we deserve giving people a chance to get to know us as a human being before discounting us as freaks? Yeah, absolutely. You aren't obligated to tell them anything until probably you decide to have sex with them. And then I think that they also have their rights to their identity that comes into conflict with your rights to privacy. Here's another quote by the same person about denial of sex as oppression. This act of conceptualizing us as desexed and unfuckable is directly attached to larger systems of oppression, dehumanization, and invalidation we face. I know I'm not sugarcoating my opinions here, but I am actually extremely empathetic to the rejection and loneliness and frustration trans people feel trying to go out and date. But the argument I use against this is that trans people are not the only people who suffer loneliness and rejection. I made this point in another video I did called The Collapse of the Lesbian Community and Why You Should Resist It, when I talked about trans women who feel entitled to guilt-trip lesbians who aren't interested in having sex with them. You know, many people suffer loneliness, but this doesn't justify sexual and emotional access to anyone. I've always been a very intense, diehard, hopeless, romantic with a raging sex drive. When I was younger, it's gotten better, but I had serious generalized anxiety disorder, and this also manifested itself in social anxiety disorder as well. Coming out and dating was extremely difficult for me. I had terrible luck and hardly any experiences, and the ones I did have were terrible and very brief, and this went on for years and years. I fully understand what total, complete, utter desperation feels like. And I still just can't imagine ever thinking, how can I figure out how to get someone to date and fuck me who otherwise would really not be comfortable with it or into it? So it's just a self-centered mentality and way of viewing the world that I just don't understand, to be honest. I'm unfuckable to 97% of the female population. Many straight women are completely grossed out at even the thought of lesbian sex, and people are entitled to their own desires and their own disgusts. And these disgusts are often not just cultural, but they're hardwired when it comes to things like gender identity and sexual orientation. So move to an urban area with a big queer scene and find other trans people and pansexuals who will love you for you. They're out there. So I want to talk about these gender fraud cases and lesbians. Almost all of the commentary I read on lesbian social media around this strongly condemned this behavior, which I'm happy to see, even though most people thought a lot of these victims were supremely stupid, but there are a couple of notable exceptions. So one was Carrie Lyle, I think is how it's pronounced. She's one of the editors for the queer women's magazine Diva in Britain, and she wrote this about the Newland case. I'm not for a moment suggesting that the victim's version of events is untrue, and I don't want to cast aspersions on the testimony of a young woman, especially when so many do in rape and sexual assault cases. I'm neither judge nor jury, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't also feel sympathy for Newland, who sobbed in the dock last week as she was sentenced to 8 years. What happened here was tragic and sad, and guilty or not, it seems to me that Newland, like the victim, is a vulnerable young woman who needs support, not 8 years behind bars. So I would forgive Carrie Lyle here for defending Newland if she just could not believe this really went on for 10 sexual encounters without her partner knowing and just didn't buy it. But that's not what she's saying here. She's saying that we need to have sympathy and compassion for Newland, who, like the victim, is a vulnerable young woman who needs support. If Lyle is admitting this person's guilt, she is completely excusing the extreme lengths this person went to using remarkably manipulative behaviors for her own personal, sexual, and emotional gratification. Carrie Lyle is exceedingly naive if she doesn't understand that there are some very selfish and narcissistic people out there who will control everything around them to just get exactly what they want. Julie Bindel is a staunch feminist and anti-rape activist who said, "I understand rape is only ever the fault and responsibility of the rapist." She's characterized the Newland court decision as a case of lesbian hating in one of the comments that I saw. Again, I wouldn't be bothered by this if Bindel just found this case too unbelievable, which I think she does, but she's coming out pretty strongly in support of Newland when I think that this is ironic given the position she takes when men are accused of abusing women. So unless she knows something I don't, I'm not really sure why she's doing this. If Newland is guilty, she is a sociopath. These people have symptoms of narcissistic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, or some various combination of these things. And some of these people are women. And, lesbian and bisexual young women need to know that they aren't completely safe from abuse just because they're dating other women. And I think that these lesbian writers are really clouding the reality of the extent of these violations and deceptions and the right to consent with queer theory and misplaced compassion and altruism, really. And I think in the case of Lyle's comments, it's also kind of a case of reverse sexism. It's pretty rare that lesbians excuse men abusing or raping women, but here in this case, Newland is just a poor, confused, vulnerable woman that needs our sympathy. So men are responsible for their behavior, but women aren't. So I don't know. I don't want to be associated with that, and I'll be the first one to come out if Newland can prove her accuser was lying, and I will donate to her fund to sue the hell out of her if she can do that. But I haven't heard anything 100% convincing yet, and in the meantime, I'm not risking capping for any bad people. And if other lesbians want to, okay. So what's causing this to happen? One of the main reasons, of course, is the internet. The internet makes it a lot easier for people to find gullible targets. But why have so many young females done this recently? I think it's really important to look what's going on in our own community. You would think that the increase of tolerance for trans people and homosexuality would reduce this kind of dysfunctional behavior. And a relaxation of uptight sexual norms, is a good thing in a lot of ways because they're really oppressive, but sexuality needs some structure. And young people need to have some structure and to learn, at the very least, to respect other people's boundaries. And I think that everyone in the LGBT community should get behind that concept and not defend this behavior, which is happening, especially in trans activism, and I don't think that that's a good thing at all. I want to read some quotes here from the anti-gender fraud movement because I really want to highlight the blatant selfishness in them. Here is a statement by a trans man and lawyer, Stephen Whittle. The real problem for Chris and the others in these cases was that they were isolated and not in touch with the trans community, so did not have the benefit of people like me telling them to spill the beans because it would probably just get the young woman into bed even more quickly. You know, that's great, Stephen. That's great. That's what's really important to emphasize here. There wasn't one single comment on this asshole's blog post that indicated 1 ounce of respect for other people's feelings, 1 ounce of respect for other people's sexual boundaries, 1 ounce of respect for other people's hurt feelings, or 1 ounce of respect for other people's identities, right? The only issue here that's important is a trans man getting laid. Again, Alex Sharp. This is the best one. Accordingly, we need to challenge the idea that sexual autonomy be viewed as an absolute right. I'm going to read that again. We need to challenge the idea that sexual autonomy be viewed as an absolute right. For some, this is tantamount to heresy or rape apologia. However, this is not a time for reticence, not while the attrition against trans and genderqueer kids continues unabated. Sexual autonomy, as apparently understood by the CPS and by those who helped shape prosecutorial policy in this area, renders sacred the subjective experience of complainants, even to the point of denying others the capacity for self-determination. So I just consider the idea that people are arguing whether or not sexual autonomy is an absolute right to be just pretty goddamn disturbing, in my opinion. So here's another quote from Natalie Reid, and this is interesting. This is an interesting quote. Now, why is it her obligation to tell you and not your obligation to ask? Here we encounter several layers of cis-normativity and privilege. There is, for instance, how you're walking around simply assuming that everyone is cisgender. I'm sorry, but if the realization that some women are trans is something so far out of your mind that you can't even be bothered to take into consideration and be responsible for your own feelings about that, we're not going to hold your hand and take special care to remind you of this. Then we have the idea that although it's your hang-up that is generating the potential conflict, we have to predict the possibility, account for it, and take it on as our own ethical responsibility. This is unbelievably privileged and selfish. And why didn't you inform us that you are a transphobe, huh? Isn't it your ethical responsibility to disclose to a potential partner that you have major hang-ups about transgenderism prior to hooking up? After all, if I'd known you were a transphobe, I wouldn't have consented to sleeping with you. It's rape by deception. So, okay, I think your turnabout argument is interesting here, and probably the best argument I've heard out of all of these. So I'll give you that. I still just can't support that. It's reasonable to expect the majority to consider the minute possibility of every pretty obscure and unusual situation, really. And, but if you pass well and you want to conduct your sex life that way, and you go ahead. What they don't know won't hurt them, I guess. But unfortunately, in the real world, what you're actually asking, I think, will serve to make it more unsafe for trans people. And I don't want that, because I certainly don't advocate for any violence against trans people, which is already a huge problem. And I don't want any violence perpetrated towards them for gender fraud, or because I don't think they deserve that, or for any other reason. But if you have every young macho buck asking every woman if she's trans on the dance floor and in bars or in every other superficial hookup situation, you risk being outed in, some pretty potentially dangerous environments. If you like women, not so much. But that's what the effect is going to be of what you're actually asking here in the real world of the heterosexual male. And we all need to navigate our safety as women in the real world of the heterosexual male, not the ideal world, unfortunately. I mean, I'm sorry that it's that way, but it is for all women. So in conclusion, I think it's one thing if a judge punishes certain groups they don't like with harsher sentences in court cases. I think it's one thing to question the believability of a case as crazy as the Newland case. I think it's one thing to argue over how the law should handle these situations, if at all. But anyone that argues against the idea that people have a right to their body, autonomy, needs to be pretty aggressively confronted for the, selfish people that they are. And a blogger with a site called The Idge of Reason sums up perfectly why. That's Idge spelled with an I. IDGE, of reason. Apparently she was asking for it, was a bigot, and therefore the man, who turned out not to be a man but a woman, had every right to do this to her. It was just a little deception. She's overreacting. The victim here is the woman who did this to her. She's lying because what she was subjected to is so unbelievable that it must be in her imagination, even though there is a conviction and reams of evidence demonstrating the extraordinary lengths her abuser went to do this to her. This is an alleged offense. It's not rape. Maybe if she hadn't been such a bigot and been so squeamish and just said yes and accepted her cunt was not part of her body but public property to be used at will, the true victim of this crime would not be in prison. It's not like when Julia Assange raped a woman and said the same thing. It's not like Chad Emmons at all. This is one of those gray areas where women need to get to grips with the fact that identity politics means that when they are raped by someone who isn't an Asian male, it isn't rape, except it isn't treated as rape when it's an Asian male, or a white male, or a celebrity, or a footballer, or a lesbian, or a trans woman, because what women need to get to grips with is that their bodies do not belong to them, but exist entirely for other people's use when they need to. So, trans woman Jane Fay says, this is not an easy question to answer, since it encompasses clashing rights, dissonant truths. There are no easy solutions. You know what, Jane? No. Just no. This isn't complicated. The right not to fuck someone always outweighs the right to fuck them. And I don't want anything to do with any LGBT lawyer, journalist, organization, or individual that believes otherwise. So find someone that loves you for you. They're out there.